In early January, I skied on the East Coast for the first time ever. As expected, it left some strong impressions, but it may not be what you guys might expect. Here is a brief recount of a lifelong Rockies skier's first venture to the East Coast and all of the knee-jerk impressions it left me with. I'll start by recounting my experience day by day and go into the impressions I got at the end. For those who know this channel well, this trip was just me, Shang-Rei, while Arjun was researching some other mountains in a different part of the world. Now for background, this trip was just after New Year's crowds had departed. About a week prior to the start of the trip, a big rainstorm had come through and destroyed the snowpack. However, in the days leading up to my visit, temperatures had finally dropped and some natural had fallen. For the first part of the trip, I stayed in Lake Placid. I know y'all are here for the skiing, but on the first day in Lake Placid I visited the Olympic Legacy sites and really enjoyed it. Would highly recommend them for anyone heading out that way. Day 2 was spent at Whiteface. Going into this day I was a little bit concerned, as forecasts were calling for brutal wind chill and extreme wind gusts. The wind gusts ended up not being as strong and prevalent as expected, so lift operations weren't impacted. However, the extreme cold was exactly as predicted. It was one of those days where you just have to stop in the lodge every couple runs. I only went up to the summit once because it was so brutally cold, along with a healthy dose of fog at the very top. As a whole, the mountain was extremely icy, but there were pockets that were worse and pockets that were better than others. About half of the official runs were open, but there were a few more that were closed for racing, which was a little bit disappointing. Overall, it was just the brutal cold and wind that held this day back, otherwise it was a pretty decent day. On day 3, I visited Gore Mountain. Now, the weather forecast for Gore was looking nearly identical to that of Whiteface the day prior, so I didn't have high hopes. It said cloudy, cold, windy, and spotty showers, which is what I got at Whiteface. As soon as I got on the road, however, I realized that this wasn't the same. It was snowing, not blowing. And sure enough, when I got to the top, there was a nice soft coat on top of all the artificial repairs from the rain damage. Despite arriving quite late and leaving early, I was able to ski all of the limited terrain that was open. North Creek wasn't connected and Burnt Ridge was closed, along with all the double blacks and glades. Nonetheless, I much preferred Gore to Whiteface the day before. Maybe it was the tree-cut cruisers that felt more like home, maybe it was the less brutal weather, but nonetheless, it was just a better day overall. There were more spots at Gore with this sheer ice, where Whiteface was pretty much exclusively hardpack. Gore also had a bunch of exposed bare spots, especially on the lower mountain, while Whiteface was doing a better job repairing. That's to say that Whiteface's coverage and quality was somewhat better. Lift lines were absolutely non-existent at both Gore and Whiteface, which was really nice. Not enough was open to research for an insider's guide, and the snow wasn't as good, but the weather was significantly nicer and the day was overall a huge success. It was just a more enjoyable experience overall than Whiteface. Day 4 we drove to Vermont, and it was on this day that I realized that wind and brutal cold was going to be a theme for the entire rest of the trip. I stayed closer to Sugarbush and Stowe, but ended up spending days 5 and 6 at Killington and Okemo respectively, due to them being on the southern edge of the big cold front, leaving them a touch warmer and less windy. The Killington day, the weather forecast said snow tapering off mid-morning. It did no such thing. With light to moderate snowfall consistent throughout the day, along with 40-mile-per-hour plus wind gusts, it was blizzard conditions all day long. I was partially regretting going to Killington that day about halfway through the day. When I got home and checked the snow reports from the other mountains, I realized how lucky I was that I had chosen Killington. That day, Stowe and Sugarbush had both closed all but one of their major lifts. I consider that to be the mountain closed. I think ski resorts should give money back to those situations, but that's for another video. Nonetheless, skiing Killington was an absolute blast. Its snow was significantly better than what I had experienced in New York, and there were some more challenging runs open that were left ungroomed. I even got a little bit of glade skiing in. I managed to hit all of the mountain areas, and while there was a snag with the GoPro microphone rendering some clips without audio, it was overall a good, albeit frozen and brittle day. Day 6 was the Okemo day. For this day, I decided to take it easy and stick to the groomers for the most part. It was equally as windy, but was actually partly sunny, which helped to take the edge off. Due to wind, Sunburst was closed, making it super annoying to lap the summit runs. I went into the day not expecting much, but I actually learned a lot about how the mountain flows, partially by being forced to go into the Glades Peak area. There's a lot I can tell from a trail map ahead of time, but I discovered I was quite wrong about some things. In order to have enough for an insider's guide, the name of the game is efficiency. We'll go into this more in the impressions section, but a sheer lack of crowds in every facet of the mountain made it super easy for me to cover all the major areas, just like usual. I found a rudimentary solution to the audio problem from Killington, so the footage is much better from Okemo. Overall, of the 4 days up to that point, Okemo was the best. It wasn't quite as cold, wasn't white out, wasn't terribly icy overall, although there were still spots. The grooming coverage was immaculate. I found lots of fun areas, I got lots of content out of it, and I left the mountain with a huge smile. Can't ask for much more. The next day, we finally decided to hit Mad River Glen. We had been holding off, praying for better snow conditions, but we decided it was the best it was going to be and sent it for day 7. Just as expected, snow conditions were a mix of fantastic and terrible. No better way to put it. The wind had filled in some runs super nicely and left others nearly bare. The thing about Mad River Glen, as we'll go more into in the Insider's Guide in March, is that they don't close much due to conditions. You just have to make good decisions. For the most part, I did, but there were admittedly some places I probably shouldn't have been, at least for trying to take care of my skis as much as I do. All that's to say, while the conditions were nice on some runs, I skied some that were wind-scoured and got some pretty bad rock hits as a result. Mad River Glen is commonly discussed as one of the most difficult in the East. I skied most of their blacks in some pretty variable conditions, and while I didn't do much tree skiing, I'm going to go on record and say I think I conquered it sufficiently. It was a much shorter day for me, as the wind was absolutely whipping and I had skied all of the major runs, so I headed back at about 2. Unfortunately, the next day of the trip was the final day. I was torn between Sugarbush and Stowe for this last day. Sugarbush has been having lift issues all season long, even outside of the wind. Additionally, they weren't yet spinning Castle Rock, so I would have had to hike to ski that terrain. On the other hand, Stowe was a bit longer of a drive, but held a higher likelihood of me being able to do sufficient research for an insider's guide. The only two things I was a little bit worried about with Stowe was potential crowd, since the final day of the trip was a Friday, and whether or not the front 4 would be open. I decided that small chance of crowds was worth it for the prospect of a potential insider's guide. As far as the front 4 went, I decided to risk it, and it didn't pay off. The front 4 were not open, despite them appearing to have plenty of snow. The Mansfield gondola didn't open all day, despite it appearing to be just fine to open. However, the closure of the gondola and front 4, along with the icing holds on the Spruce Peak side, made for some less than ideal situations, which I'll adapt into a Hater's Guide episode later this season. I got lots of good skiing and footage of all different types of terrain, but it could only do so much to make the day better. Overall, Stowe was by far my most productive day of the trip, despite Vail Resorts doing everything in their power to stop me. You'll understand what that means after you watch the Hater's Guide. It also had the best weather, at a balmy 20 and sunny with light wind. However, it just wasn't the best day because it felt like the mountain mismanaged their reopening after the big blizzard from the previous couple days. It wasn't the worst way to end a trip, but it also wasn't the best. Alright, that's it for the day by day. Now let's move to the impressions. These are, of course, my knee-jerk impressions, and I would love to hear any East Coast locals' thoughts down below. Some of these may just be a result of the time I was there and not representative at all of the overall East Coast experience, so I'd like to make it very clear that this is all inferred and opinionated and should not be used as advice. First of all, the driving. I was at the New York ski areas on a weekend and the Vermont ski areas on a weekday, but neither ever had any traffic. We encountered some pretty nasty weather and snow on the roads, but nothing snarled our travels. Out west, it feels like all it takes is one snowflake to turn the mess that already is I-70 into a 3-hour absolute traffic jam slog. Out east, it could be 10 minutes before we'd see a single other car. There was absolutely zero ski traffic, and the driving overall felt much more relaxed. Unlike in Colorado, where if you go the speed limit, you instantly have someone tailgating you or making an illegal pass, in Vermont especially, everybody kept a good distance, never pressing to go faster. I guess it's more than driving, but rather an overall cultural thing. Colorado and out west is just more in a rush. The east was relaxed, and I loved it. Something else I noticed was that the bar always comes down on chairlifts, no questions asked, just like in Europe or New Zealand. I'm pretty sure it's a law in Vermont, but I know it's not in New York, but yet even there, every bar still came down. So that tells me that the culture isn't all about risking your life on the chairlift like it seems to be in Colorado. I believe, and will continue to believe, that Colorado and Utah and pretty much everywhere else with ski areas should have a law like this because people fall from chairlifts and die, it seems like almost every year nowadays. So I was thankful for that out east, not having to force the bar down or straight up get into a fight about basically a damn seatbelt. Also on the topic of lifts, maybe I just had the right combination of time and place throughout my trip, but the lift conversations were quite different out east. Back home, you got guys talking about which strain they smoked in the parking lot or some one-night stand. Out east, here I am on a chairlift with a guy telling me about how much he used to love blue cheese, but how he doesn't now after he ate too much of it and got sick. True story. Hilarious guy. Actually, on the mountain, there were a couple things about the East Trail networks that stood out. For one, at least at Whiteface and Gore, you could ski right through active snowmaking, right over the piles. It was very weird. Every now and then out west, you'll ski under a spot gun patching up a bare spot, but at those two it felt more regular. That wasn't the case, however, when I got to Vermont, so maybe that's solely an Orta thing. Anybody with more knowledge on this, please let me know. Another thing I noticed is that at a lot of mountains, the trees on the edge of the run are super dense. In Colorado, you can often make some improv glades because the trees are a bit spaced out. To combat having to rescue people who were in over their heads in unsanctioned glade areas, resorts out west have a tendency of roping the edges of runs to make it clear the woods are closed. Out east, they don't bother, because except in the marked, cleared, patrolled glades, the woods are typically too dense for anybody in their right mind to duck into. Something else was the snow base. They opened runs on the East Coast with way less snow than would be acceptable on the Rockies. The makings of a good skier on the East seems to be, rather than the ability to make tight turns in hair-raisingly steep terrain, the ability to dodge rocks, glare ice, and tree stumps. But to go along with that, the runs seem generally easier out east, at least in terms of steepness and natural features. I feel like the harder conditions and easier runs is pretty well known, so I won't go too much more into that. As a result of those two things, however, I noticed that a lot higher percentage of terrain at East Coast mountains is groomed, which also makes sense. And of course, as we just touched on, the snowmaking is a lot stronger, with more coverage out east to make up for the lesser conditions. Something that is almost certainly just a result of the timing of my trip was the sheer bitter cold. But it does make me wonder, is the East Coast generally colder than out west? It went from 45 degrees to single digits in less than a week, so I'm comfortable saying that the East sees more drastic temperature swings than the Rockies, although Tahoe and the Cascades I can't speak on. But I've rarely seen single digits in the Rockies. Typically the coldest days are in the teens. So did I just have horrible timing with my East Coast trip, or is it just plain cold out there? Locals, let me know. And something that I am almost certain was a result of the cold, windy weather and being there mostly on weekdays was a sheer lack of lift lines everywhere I went, which was nice. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm sure long lift lines appear on good weather powder days and peak days just like out west. One final thing I'm not sure about, however, was empty lodges. Even on weekdays in Colorado, it can be hard to find a seat in a lodge. But out east, on the weekdays, the lodges were entirely empty, which makes me wonder if instead of stalking, hunting, and fighting for a table like you have to do in Colorado, it might be a little bit more tame on weekends out east. Is it reasonable, actually finding a seat in lodges on busy days, or does it get just as bad? Okay, that about wraps it up for the major impressions I had, and that should reasonably conclude this video. A shout out to Wibbly and Chris P for correctly guessing the mystery run in the overcrowding video. If you want to be shouted out in a future video just like this, keep an eye out for mystery runs and guess them down in the comments below. If you enjoyed this type of behind the scenes content, head over to srgskiing.com and look for the blog, where we post text versions of this type of trip report all the time. It'll be linked down below. Thank you all so much for watching. All my love, I'm out.